This epic duel between Alireza Firouzja and Magnus Carlsen left Carlsen feeling stunned. It took place in 2020 in the Magnus Carlsen Invitational event, which was an online rapid tournament. So Firouzja kicked off with pawn to e4 and Magnus went in for the Sicilian here. We had knight f3, knight c6 and now bishop b5. So Firouzja goes in for the Rossolimo variation. I did cover an absolute crush he played in this variation in less than 23 moves recently. So if you want to see that video at the end, then check out the card here. Magnus here played pawn to e6 instead of knight f6, which we saw in that game. And Firouzja responded now with bishop takes on c6, the standard move. We had b recaptures and now d3 from Firouzja. Magnus now plays this trendy queen c7 move and he's basically preparing e5 here but without going d6 and then giving white something to bite on by playing e5. And Firouzja responds with a strange queen move of his own, queen to e2, again neglecting the standard development or a castling move, and basically he's bringing a heavy piece to the e-file here, which is standard, but he wants to keep options open for this rook because normally white castles and then brings the rook to the e-file. Magnus now goes pawn to e5, staking a claim in the centre, and we have knight b to d2 looking at this square which has been weakened by the b pawn coming to c5. We have knight e7 now from Magnus. This is a better journey to potentially go on than bringing it to f6. Knight c4 now from Firouzja and knight g6 from Magnus. And now h4 from Firouzja, a standard move looking to kick this knight. So Magnus responds with pawn to h5, not letting Firouzja take that space. We had pawn to g3 now to keep the knight out of this f4 square. Pawn to d6 now from Magnus. And now bishop to d2 from Firouzja developing, also looking in this direction potentially. So we had pawn to f6 from Magnus, and this is something you'll note from both players. They're hesitant to commit the king too early and they shuffle their pieces, kind of doing a dance around each other and waiting to see how the other commits in terms of king position and pawn structure. We had knight to e3 now from Firouzja and bishop to e7 from Magnus. So these pawns make the bishop look terrible here, but there is a rerouting manoeuvre that can bring that bishop out into the game later on. We had knight g1 now from Firouzja, so a clear indication that he's not quite sure of how he wants to play yet. He begins to re-manoeuvre this knight, although that does become a problem piece as we'll see. So bishop to d8 from Magnus, he continues this re-manoeuvre. We had queen to f3 from Firouzja and knight to f8 from Magnus. So again he begins to shuffle this piece, redeploy it to where he thinks is a better square. It should be noted that this is rapid, so whilst neither player is committing on a plan here, they're both keen not to make new weaknesses if they can avoid it. Firouzja now drops the knight into e2, we had knight into e6 here, and the queen drops back into g2, clearing the way for an f-pawn advance in future. And now pawn to a5 from Magnus, so he begins to claim some space on the queen side. Again, Firouzja shuts that down. He could have considered leaving it to come down the board and getting on with his own plans, but okay, he doesn't want to give too much space. We had knight to d4 now from Magnus, occupying this nice outpost. We don't want to kick it with c3 because then we give up the b3 square. So instead Firouzja plays pawn to f4, beginning the process of gaining counterplay on the king side. And now bishop to e6 from Magnus, so he finally deploys that light squared bishop and he's looking to support a d5 or a c4 advance here through this move. Firouzja plays b3 now, trying to bolster the light squares, and Magnus plays queen to d7, a multi-purpose move, clearing the way for this bishop to come out to the b6 square and also looking to support this d5 push in future. Pawn to f5 now from Firouzja, so he's not seeing much to be gained by opening the f-file because then it would open the d-file for Magnus, and instead he wants to try and push g4, g5 at a later point potentially. So the bishop drops back into f7. We had knight to c1 now, and we can see that this piece is becoming a bit of a problem. So it's gone from f1 to g1 to e2 to c1. Not a beautiful journey, and this is the problem with these cramping pawns in the centre that Magnus has. This piece is now just playing a purely defensive role. Pawn to d5 now from Magnus, so he seizes on this passive move from Firouzja and breaks in the centre immediately. And Firouzja now finally commits his king because he sees that the centre's getting ripped open, and Magnus follows up with pawn to c4. So really beautiful how he's ripping apart this pawn chain here, undermining it from the base. B takes c4 is now played by Firouzja. Magnus recaptures there, and Firouzja actually takes with the d pawn, giving himself a ruined pawn structure here, which isn't beautiful to look at. But the problem is that he didn't want to leave himself with a weak pawn on d3, so if he'd let Magnus take here, say he played rook b1, Magnus captured, Firouzja recaptured, now he has a weak backwards d pawn, and if he takes with the knight, well, the c pawn is becoming weak, and it even runs into an immediate tactic here with knight takes on c2, taking advantage of this loose piece here. So coming back here, that's why Firouzja took on c4, even though it's not a nice move to play. So Magnus now redeploys the bishop to b6, completing that manoeuvre, and after rook b1, we had queen to a7, lining up a beautiful battery looking down towards the white king, and there's a perfect harmony to Magnus's play here, which is really nice to watch, how this bishop remanoeuvred like this, how the queen then got out of the way and swung back, and this beautiful knight on d4 came from g6 if we remember. So it went f8, e6, d4. Very instructive how Magnus has taken over the position here. Firouzja played king to h2 now, stepping away from that dangerous diagonal. Magnus plays rook to d8, coming to the open file. We had rook to b2 now, defending this c2 pawn. Castles now from Magnus to activate the second rook. And pawn to g4 now from Firouzja, desperately seeking some counterplay on the king side. Knight to e2 now from Magnus, so he knows he can't just sit there and let Firouzja take on h5, bring a rook to the g file, so he immediately initiates play in the centre. Now if Firouzja takes this knight, we note that the bishop drops here, and so instead Firouzja took that knight with the queen. You can't really leave it sitting there because it's coming into f4 if nothing else. So Firouzja took with the queen, and now this is the point. Magnus takes on d2 with the rook, and after the queen recaptures, bishop takes on e3. So he's won two minor pieces for the rook, and he has a very dangerous dark squared bishop now causing havoc on these dark squares. So after Firouzja sidestepped with the queen, Magnus jumped in with queen to d4, a beautiful centralising move, hitting this unprotected rook. Firouzja played knight d3 to protect the rook, but now we see the problem of Firouzja's weak pawns coming back to bite him. So Magnus takes on e4, we have rook to e1 from Firouzja to protect the queen from this threat of playing bishop g1 and then picking up the unprotected queen. And after the rook defends the queen like this, Magnus goes bishop f4 check. Note that we don't take that bishop with the knight, or after queen recaptures check, king g2, we then take on c4 with the bishop. So instead of this, after bishop f4 check, Firouzja jumped up the board with the king, and now Magnus picks up a second pawn on c4 here. So Firouzja desperately tries to initiate counterplay now with pawn takes on h5. He's losing in the centre and on the queen side, so he has to try and go for mate. Magnus now plays the bishop back to h6, Firouzja now plays rook to b7, and we can see that this counterplay is now getting really serious in combination with the open g file. We have queen takes on a4 from Magnus, so if he can survive this attack, then this pawn advantage in the centre will be completely crushing. But rook to g1 now from Firouzja, and rook to d8 from Magnus in response. So things are really hotting up here, and it's going to come down to who can break through to whose king first. We had rook to g3 now from Firouzja to overprotect his third rank. Queen to a1 now from Magnus, and you can't go queen g4 here or you're running into queen h1 checkmate. So that's why Firouzja first plays knight to f2 here, and he also sets a really sneaky trap which Magnus now falls into. So Magnus jumps in with rook to d2 here, supported by the bishop, hitting the queen and the knight and setting up all kinds of deadly threats along these ranks. But what Carlsen had overlooked is this awesome response from Firouzja. Rook to b8 here, because Carlsen's left the back rank with his last move. King to h7, looks like the king is perfectly fine running to safety, but queen g4 sets up deadly threats that can't be avoided, because after queen to f1 check from Magnus, rook to g2 defending, Magnus actually had no choice here but to give up his queen, and after king recaptures he resigned. And the reason he did so is that there's no way to avoid a stunning checkmate here. So say Magnus had captured the knight on f2, now we have queen g6 check. And after the bishop recaptures, we can take with either pawn here, setting up this beautiful smothered checkmate with pawn and rook. So an awesome game there between both players, and true testament to Firouzja's fighting spirit in the face of a worse position. If you enjoyed this video, then hit subscribe here, and to see another epic duel between these two players, click here. Thanks for watching and see you soon.